Welcome to part one of a three-part series about your story and how it can form the foundation of your personal brand. Let's go. In this video, I'm going to start by covering the foundation of why your story is important. I'm going to dive into the three-part series, an overview of the three-part structure that I'm going to take you through. I'm going to share a little bit about my background and how I learned about story and where this information comes from. And finally, and I think most importantly in this video, I'm going to share with you how to identify the right story and the right stories to carry your brand out into the world. And I'll also share a few things to watch out for as you are developing your stories. Let's go. One of the things that I find most fascinating about this topic is that stories are such a part of who we are as humans. If you think about it, stories are really the foundations of civilization. They are the way that we as humans pass down lessons from one generation to the next. Before we even had a written word, before we had a way to record history, it was passed down verbally, orally, through story. In other words, stories are deeply programmed into us as a way that we learn. If you want to connect with an audience, if you want to excite people, if you want to create an emotional engagement, then telling a story is one of the best ways, if not the best way, to do that. Now, as someone who's in the world of speakers and authors and coaches and other superstars, I get to see a lot of stories. And I've even seen people build entire businesses around one specific story. Here's one example. Perhaps you've heard of Bethany Hamilton. Bethany Hamilton is a famous motivational speaker. She's written a book, and there's a whole movie about her story. Why? Well, because she was a surfer and she got attacked by a shark and she lost her arm, and she's had to rebuild her life after that. Now, her story is really powerful and there are a lot of lessons in it. She's got a lot of beautiful themes that she pulls through her story. And one thing I would invite you to consider is that she would not be doing what she's doing. She would not be a motivational speaker, an author, movie person, if she hadn't had this experience happen to her and if she hadn't figured out that she needed to tell her story to the world. And so maybe your story is not getting attacked by a shark, but everyone has a story. And what I want to do in this three-part sequence, especially if you're in my retreat program right now, is to help you mine your background and your story for those key themes that are going to support you looking inward, making sure that you're aligned with your purpose, aligned with your passions, aligned with your values, aligned with the mission that you're here to do on this planet and the purpose that you serve. So your story is a great way to look for, if you're not sure what any of those things are, your purpose, your mission, your vision, all those things, then your story is a great place to mine for that information. So that's the importance of doing this work. So this three-part sequence that I put together of videos is, number one is identifying the story that you want to tell, or stories. Number two is structuring the stories. And part three is how to weave the stories throughout all of the work that you're doing, your branding, your marketing, all of that good stuff. Now, I'm actually not a story expert. That's not what I do. That's not what I specialize in, although I help my clients a lot with their stories. But I want to give credit where it's due. Some of the influences who've helped me learn this, who've taught me methodologies and structures are, number one, Andy Enriquez. He's a good friend. He's a genius. And his whole business is built around helping people with their stories. So if you want to go deeper, I did do a podcast episode with Andy where I interviewed him. And he actually helped me workshop one of my stories. So I'm going to go ahead and link to that podcast below in the notes. Another person that helped me with my own stories and who I look up to is Darren LaCroix. So Darren also, I have a podcast episode with him. This was on his podcast where he helped me workshop one of my signature stories. So I invite you to also check out that link below if you want to go deeper into this topic. Finally, I just want to let you know that I keep a running set of notes in Evernote where I'm constantly keeping track and writing down new story ideas. Like when something happens to me in a day and I see that there's a lesson in it or something that I might want to pull into my content, I go and I capture it in this place. And I highly recommend you keep your own database of stories if you don't already. So now let's get into identifying the right story, or how to find a story, how to if you have no idea, like, where do I even begin? This will help you with that. Now, first, I want to be clear too that something I learned from Andy is that your story can be used in a lot of different contexts. The same story might have a whole bunch of different themes and meanings and lessons. And you can pull forward certain themes for certain occasions and pull forward different themes for other occasions. So for example, in YouTube, I have a whole video all about my story, my background, and there are many stories within that one story. But the theme that I pulled through in that video was all about how I started to focus on my strengths, my gifts, and bring my business into alignment with my true self. And that same story could be used as an example of being a workaholic and breaking down and having, burnout, and how to take care of yourself better and how to turn around your life in that way. It could also be a story of spiritual awakening. It could also be a story of finally finding a mentor that helped me with my insides, not just the outside of the business. So the story has a lot of different applications. So that's what I also invite you to, that when you do this work, you might come up with one core story, but that has many different aspects to it. Now, before I dive into the 3 big questions that can help you find good stories, I do want to invite you to take a moment and subscribe to my channel, like this video, and know that I would love to hear from you. So please go ahead and comment below. Here are 3 easy questions that you can use to find stories. The first question is, what are some defining moments in your life? Now, I have to say, this was a question that first I heard from Andy Enriquez. So I want to give credit where it's due. What are defining moments? Defining moments are moments that you can point to where something shifted or changed. Obviously, Bethany Hamilton's story, a defining moment was having her arm bitten off by a shark. What's a defining moment? It can be a moment of breakdown. It can be a moment of triumph. It can be a moment of transition. It can be something calamitous that happens. There are all sorts of defining moments, but think about those inflection points in your life where there's a before and there's an after. The second question are, what are the 3 biggest challenges that you experienced in your life? Now, I want to give you an example about how this particular question helped to create an entire brand for a client of mine. So I had a client, she was a real estate agent, and she was really struggling with this idea of her brand, her value proposition, her story. She just couldn't figure out any of it. And I was like, no problem. Let's just have a conversation about your story. So I started asking her these questions, and I asked her the second question: what is one of the biggest challenges that you overcame in your life? And it's so amazing sometimes from the outside in how easy it is to see these things where it's difficult from the inside out. Because she never considered this, but she said, well, I think the biggest challenge for me was that we moved around so much when I was a kid. And I was like, ooh, she's a real estate agent, moving, houses, ding, ding, ding. We're onto something here. So I started asking her more questions, and turns out that they moved around a ton when she was a little kid. In fact, she never spent more than a year in the same home. And so she missed out on having the stability of a home. And she now, as a real estate agent, she specialized in helping people find their dream homes. So right away, I could see the connection. Here's this person who struggled as a child and as a young person with never feeling stable and grounded and rooted. And as adults, she's chosen this career where she's helping people feel stable and grounded and rooted. You see the connection? So we were able to build a whole story about her childhood and how that gave her this desire to help other people find stable homes. And it made sense with everything that she did because, for example, one of the things that made her special was that she would go and do the research on the local school and on the local supermarket, and she would make sure that she helped people when they were coming into a new home, that they had this entire awareness of their community and all of the support systems nearby and what they would need in order to get settled in quickly and forever in this dream home. So there's an example of how a challenge can lead to a beautiful brand story. And then the third question is, what were some of the biggest wins and celebrations of your entire life? The triumphs, the moments of truth where everything all came together and the work paid off. So for each of these questions, go ahead and maybe think about 3 answers to each question. So the first question is, what are the defining moments? 3 defining moments. Second question, what are the challenges? 3 challenges. Third question, what are the wins and celebrations? 3 celebrations and wins. So go ahead and put me on pause while you fill that out and do that. And then when you come back, we'll talk about what to do with it next. Welcome back from your pause. First thing I want you to do is you look at these 9 things, or maybe more, you may have come up with more, is how did each one shape you? So go back in each one and look at how did this shape you or change you? Second question is to go back and look at, well, what were the lessons that you got from each one of these things? What did you learn? And then finally, go back through all of them and look at what elements and aspects of this story could impact and inspire others. And finally, bonus question is, how do these things relate to the work you do? So go to each one and look at, does this relate to the work I do, and how does it relate to the work I do? And ultimately, you might even want to look at all 9 of these things and see if they can be woven together into one larger story. So now that you've done that work, you've got these 9 stories, you know the lessons, you know how it might inspire and impact others, you've got some material to work with. And I invite you to take one of these stories, or more than one, into part 2 where we look at how to structure a story. But before we do that, I do want to give you a couple things to watch out for as you decide which story to pick. The first thing to watch out for is to recognize that there is a distinction between the actual story, whatever happened, and your perception, or really your story about the story. And really getting clear of what is the story and what is your story about the story. So for example, in my world, my story is that I grew up with these Cuban-American parents. They were very hardworking. They wanted me to work hard, and they wanted success and achievement. And that's part of the story, and how I kind of overcame that is my core story. But in the past, I had a story about that was that my parents were wrong or bad for having done that. There was blame in there. And so I want to call that forward, because if your story is not neutralized, if you haven't done the self-healing work around your story, and you still have a charge around the story, if you still have anger or even sadness, and that's not bad, but I would invite you to consider doing the work of healing that and what I call alchemizing that before you start using the story in your business. Because you want to have some perspective on your own story. If you're still in it, you're still angry about it, you're still, struggling with it, it might not be ready yet for it to be used in your marketing or your branding. So I'm not saying you can't have anger or sadness. I mean, of course, and you want to have a certain degree of distance from the story in order to be able to tell it powerfully and mine it for all the lessons. And then finally, just one last thing is a reminder that your story is not your destiny. Where you began is not necessarily where you end up. And so if you have a story of pain, of loss, of sadness, of blame, of whatever it is, I invite you to take this opportunity to discover what is the future of that story. What ending are you going to write for that story? Because you do get to write the ending. And that's part of what this work is about, is you choosing what this story means to you and also to the world that you're going to share it with. Okay, I hope this was interesting. You've got some really good ideas for stories, and you're ready to move on to part 2, structuring your story.